Hello and welcome. Today, we're going to talk about a word that gets thrown around a lot in Indian politics, almost like a curse word, dynasty. Now, you've probably heard a million times that it's a sign of a democracy in decay. But what if that's not the whole story? What if, in some very specific cases, these so-called dynasties are actually one of the most important shields we have for democracy? It's a pretty wild idea, so let's get into it. So, this is the big question for today. Is dynasty politics always a bad thing? I mean, the knee-jerk reaction is usually a loud yes. But the source material we're digging into today offers a really fascinating counterargument. It suggests that in the very unique playground of Indian politics, some of these long-standing political families might just be one of the last lines of defense for things like federalism and even democracy itself. All right, so here's our game plan. First, we're going to look at the real battlefield of Indian politics. Then we'll dive into why those charismatic first-generation leaders can sometimes fall short. After that, we'll introduce this idea of an ideological shield. We'll also unpack how the dynasty label gets used as a weapon. And finally, we'll tackle the double standard between inherited and elected power. Okay, so to really get this argument, you first have to understand the core idea from our source, that Indian politics isn't just about what happens on election day. Nope, it's a constant tug of war for power between two completely different forces. So on one side, you've got the elected legislatures. That's your state assembly is the Lok Sabha. They represent what the source calls federal power. They reflect the incredibly diverse regional will of the people, and they're accountable to us, the voters. But on the other side, you have these permanent unelected institutions that hold all this central power. We're talking about the judiciary, the big central agencies, the entire bureaucracy. Their power doesn't come from elections. It's institutional, it's permanent, and the source argues it's often aligned with a Delhi-centric elite, basically the concentration of power in the capital. This is the fundamental conflict right here. So with that battlefield in mind, let's see how this all plays out. You'd think that a new, non-dynastic leader, a first-generation trailblazer, would be the perfect champion for the elected federal side. But the source we're looking at says, well, not so fast. Sometimes their charisma is actually their biggest weakness. And this pattern is just so crucial to understand. These first-generation leaders are often powered by this wave of personal popularity, right? But not by a deep, multi-generational ideology. That can actually make them surprisingly fragile. They just don't have the deep institutional roots or the bench of loyalists that's been built over decades. So when that immense pressure comes from those powerful central agencies, think tax raids, corruption probes, you name it, they're often standing all alone. And to survive, they might be forced to make a deal, to compromise, to trade away state rights or federal bargaining power just to appease the center. And in doing that, they're not just saving their own skin, they end up weakening the entire legislative wing they were elected to lead. Democracy actually shrinks. So if the charismatic newcomer often fails, what's the alternative? Well, this brings us right to the heart of the argument, the power of what our source calls an ideological dynasty. And look, this is not just any family in politics. It's something very, very specific. The point here is the mix of ingredients. Yes, it's multi-generational, but, and this is key, it's been continuously validated by voters again and again for decades. And most importantly, it's not just some family business. It's the carrier, the steward of a consistent social movement or a really powerful regional identity. You could almost say it's an institution that's been built through the ballot box over half a century. And this is where the theory really comes to life. Just think about the Dravidian movement in Tamil Nadu. It is so much more than a political party. It's a social justice movement that has fundamentally shaped the state's identity. The source argues that a family like the Karunanidhi family becomes the vehicle to preserve that ideology through generations. This administrative memory they have isn't just about knowing who to call in the bureaucracy. It's about maintaining these long-term goals like social reform or linguistic rights for decades. A single leader might buckle under pressure, but an entire institution with deep roots can absolutely weather the storm. And the source poses a really critical question. Without that kind of generational continuity, would the Dravidian ideology have just fragmented under all that central pressure a long time ago? This quote just nails it, doesn't it? In this constant battle between the elected and the unelected, these ideological dynasties, hardened by decades of political fights and electoral tests, they become a kind of protective shield for regional rights and the very federal structure of the country. Okay, so this leads to a pretty logical question, right? If these families can be so important for federalism, why is dynasty politics the #1 attack line used against them? Well, the argument here is that this attack isn't always some principled stand for democracy. It's often something else entirely. You see, the dynasty label becomes this incredibly powerful weapon. According to the source, it's a moral story, a narrative that gets used to attack and delegitimize regional leaders who are just too strong, too independent, and too difficult for that central elite to control or co-opt. It's a clever way of reframing a legitimate elected regional power as something corrupt and, well, undemocratic. And it's not just words, right? This criticism almost never comes alone. It's usually paired with intense selective pressure from those central agencies we talked about. Legal cases, investigations, they all become tools in this political battle. The case of the former Tamil Nadu Chief Minister Jayalalitha is a really fascinating and complicated example of this. I mean, just look at the complexity here. It's a roller coaster, a conviction, then a dramatic acquittal that lets her return to power, and then a final confirmation of that conviction by the highest court, but only after she had passed away. Now, the point here isn't to comment on guilt or innocence, but to show the intense, politically charged legal battles that these powerful regional leaders face. The timing of it all, the back and forth, that's the key. And here, according to the source, is the ultimate giveaway. It points out that all that loud moral outrage against dynasty politics, it often goes completely silent the moment that same family decides to ally with the central ruling party. All of a sudden, cases slow down, the media's tone softens. This really suggests the criticism is less a moral principle and more of a political weapon, one that's only used against those who refuse to fall in line. This brings us to the final piece of this argument, a pretty glaring double standard in how we tend to look at privilege and power in India. It's this strange contradiction between what we call merit and what we attack as privilege. Okay, check out this contrast, because it's a huge one. On one side, you have technocrats, or nominated members of the Rajya Sabha, the upper house, who can hold immense power without ever having to win a single direct election from the people. Their position is often framed as being based on merit. But then on the other side, you have a second or third generation leader who, despite having to win the trust of millions of voters in brutal elections over and over again, is dismissed simply as privilege. One form of inherited advantage gets a pass, while the other, the one that actually has to face democratic approval, gets condemned. And this isn't just theory, it has real-world consequences. The source argues that because these dynastic leaders are anchored in these long-standing social justice movements, they often have the institutional security to challenge really entrenched power structures, like caste. Think about Udayanidhi Stalin challenging Sanatana Dharma's hierarchy, or Rahul Gandhi pushing for a caste census. They are directly poking at institutional bias, and they're backed by a political base that's been built over generations. By contrast, a lot of first-generation leaders who need to build a coalition fast tend to rely on these broader, majoritarian narratives instead of risking an upset of that deep-rooted institutional order. So where does all of this leave us? Well, the argument builds to a pretty powerful conclusion about what a political dynasty can actually become over a long enough period of time. After half a century or more, after being tested and retested, validated and revalidated by the people through election after election, the source claims that a political dynasty stops being just a family. It transforms. It actually becomes a democratic institution in its own right, one that's deeply rooted in the society it represents. So let's be super clear about the takeaways here. The argument isn't that dynasties are perfect or shouldn't be criticized. Of course not. Accountability is always vital. But it suggests we have to be really critical of how the anti-dynasty label is being used. When it's weaponized, it's often not a defense of democracy, but an attack on federalism. It becomes a tool to empower the unelected center at the expense of the elected regions that are often defended by these time-tested ideological institutions. And that leaves us with one final, really challenging question to chew on. The next time you hear the term dynasty politics used as an attack, it's worth asking yourself, is this criticism really about strengthening the will of the voters? Or is it a convenient story told to weaken a regional shield, and in doing so, strengthen the hand of a permanent, unelected power center? It's a question worth thinking about. Thanks for tuning in.